All right, welcome to everyone to this session for demand data management in Visum. Here's the agenda for today. We'll have a look at first the overview of the data model. Then we'll have a look at creating user-defined attributes and tables that go into typical demand models in Visum. Then we'll have a look at creating a model structure in Visum, as well as transferring and storing these model structures from one file to the other. We also have a look at some common elements that come into play with data management, like using list views and table views. And finally, we'll take a look at the matrix editor in Visum and give an overview of some things that can be applied with the matrix editor. All right, so let's start with our session for today. We take a look at the overview of the demand model or demand structure in Visum. One of the things that might differ in Visum compared to some of the other model structures that you're familiar with or you've been working with is that Visum requires a definition of a demand model structure before you can actually use features such as the built-in trip generation, distribution, mode choice, nested mode choice, and so forth. So it's essential to create this model structure and then link it with the data to be able to use it in the entire object-oriented format. Visum stores these components in a modular and object-oriented structure with support given for various elements. So we have the 4-step model component supported over here. We also support the tour-based model in this structure. And also now we have started supporting the activity or agent-based model structures with disaggregate objects for households, persons, and so forth. In Visum, you can combine the above model structures, so you can create one or more model structures and have them managed in the same model. A typical example of this would be, let's say you have a 4-step model for the external trips and an activity-based model for the internal trips. You can manage this in a dual model structure in the same file in Visum, and that way it makes your data management neat and robust. The chart over here shown gives you the level of detail for each of these different model structures. This is more or less the entirety of the model structure if you go down all the way to the agent-based or activity-based model components. But then these get more aggregated and essential as you go up the aggregation chain from activity to agent-based models. For 4-step model, which is the more common format that you may have been using for F-dot models, we store primarily the market segments or demand groups, which might be things like home-based work trips or trip types with different income classification in what we call demand strata in Visum. So a lot of the other elements might be redundant in your 4-step models that you might see for the region. Now that we have some of these definitions shown, let's take a look at what some of this information looks like or data looks like in a Visum file. I have my Olympus training model loaded over here. So the demand model components in this are stored in demand and then demand models. Over here, you can see that I have one demand model and then the modes associated with it. And these can be checked on or off depending on what modes are applicable to this particular demand model structure. So let's say you have a passenger model and a freight model, then you can make modes available or unavailable based on the type of that model. Here we have a standard 4-step setup, but this can be switched to either one of these different models. The most typical models in our case over here in North America would be the four-step model, the tour-based model possibly, and then the activity-based models. Then we have components for person groups. If you have stored data in a more disaggregate level, for example, the tour-based model. Also then the activity pairs. And for the four-step model, we have over here the demand strata. And these correspond to your calculation stratification for the demand model. These names can be simply typed and edited, and we'll have a look at this in one of the exercises that we conduct over here. But generally, this also supports copy paste. So let's say you're creating these names in a more automated way in Excel or something like that. These can be modified and added. So that reduces your burden of kind of typing the whole thing in cell by cell format. All right. Corresponding to the demand model, we also have a definition for the supply network. And we looked at some of the network components or network management last time. And this gives an overview of how these are linked and why these are maintained in a little separate layer. So the supply component of transport systems and mode groupings provide you a flexible format for multi-class network assignments. This is a general structure of how modes and transport systems are grouped in Visum. So here you can see that private transport, or let's say trucks and cars, have pretty much a one-to-one relationship with, when we say transport system, it also means modes. But when we say transport system in the context of transit or public transport, we can have multiple transport systems defined as buses, trams, subway, metro, and such. And then these can be further grouped into another primary mode, which is, let's say, an overall transit mode. So this way, bus and tram form the submodes of this primary mode. And then these can be assigned to different demand segments, which is essentially your demand class. The demand class is linked with the different response to generalized costs and such. And generally, that will be linked with the demand matrices. So this way, this two-tier structure provides you the ability to essentially just have these demand segments and not have the prior model structure or demand strata that we discussed in the previous slide, and create still traffic assignments or transit assignments only in a network model. This might be applicable in cases where you already have, let's say, a demand model, but you'd like to import that demand model for traffic assignment, let's say more specifically with sub-area modeling and such with microsimulation, and you just need a demand matrix. In that case, this structure for TSYS modes is adequate for you to be able to assign the network, clip the sub-area, or even use the entire region just for traffic and transit assignments. Let's have a look at where these elements are stored in Visum, so you have an idea of which menus to use to explore these. Again, back in my Visum file, I have demand, and then the very first option over here is transport systems, modes, and demand segments. Now here you can see the three tabs for transport systems, modes, and demand segments. Here I have different types of modes. So if I sort by this, you can take a look at this as the private transport, which we define as PRT modes. And then you can see a one-to-one relationship between the transport system over here and the mode. But then in the PUT mode, we have the transit modes, which can be grouped under different transport systems, can be grouped under different transit modes. So this allows you to group modes like, let's say you have a premium versus non-premium transit mode and such, to create different modes and then group them differently with the different transport systems. So you can see a certain grouping over here. One thing that you see in common over here is this W or walk mode. This walk mode is necessary in Visum, or walk transport system is necessary in Visum to allow walk access to any of the transit services. So this is kind of an access mode to any of the transit market segments that you will be modeling. So this one is specifically defined then as the PUT walk because it just essentially means the walk access to transit mode. This need not be confused with walk access as in park and ride versus not park and ride. Even if you have a park and ride mode, you would still have to have this because this still allows you to then model all of the walk transfers in the network and so forth. Finally, we have the different demand segments over here, and you can see that different modes are grouped under different demand segments, and these demand segments are then further used for the traffic and transit assignment. The linkage for the traffic and transit assignment matrix with the demand segment is then defined in demand and then demand data. And over here, you can see that the demand segments have certain matrices defined for them. You can see over here that this is a multi-class assignment for auto, for example. So we have the external trips linked with the external matrix, and then the SOV trips, shared ride trips, and so forth are linked with the shared ride SOV matrix and so forth. And then we have the trucks in a separate container. And what this whole thing does is essentially creates path containers for each of these market segments. So when you then run the post assignment analysis, for example, select link calculations and such, these containers are used to neatly manage all of the path data and produce multi-class select link analysis, or you can filter out a certain demand class from the select link analysis and such. Next, let's have a look at creating user-defined attributes and tables in Visum. User-defined attributes in Visum are used to store model demand and supply data used in calculations. So for example, typically this would be your capacity calculations, population, household data for the zonal level or the MAZ level, turn prohibitions, or also special penalties or delays that you might want to add on to a turning cost and such. So here's the typical usage of user-defined attributes in Visum. This would be to hold your population, household, dwelling unit, cross-classified population data, and employment-related characteristics. Then we have links turns, which might hold special attributes or calculated attributes for speed and capacity that you want to transfer at the time of assignment, functional class descriptions, area type descriptions, and such. All of these go in user-defined attributes in Visum. The points of interest may hold the user-defined attributes of other miscellaneous GIS data elements, where you might have different fields in your GIS shapefile, which you want to bring in as an underlay or overlay on the network. And those are all stored again as user-defined attributes. Then we have user-defined tables. These tables are not specifically linked to any network layer, like the typical net tables that you see with Visum list views. And these user-defined tables can be used for storing lookup tables, model coefficients, model parameters, special generator information, and so forth, and then can be linked or used in your calculations for the Visum models. Lastly, we have matrices. The matrices in Visum are classified as calculated matrices, which come from running processes like skimming, distribution, mode choice, and so forth. Then we can have fixed matrices, which might be external to external matrices that are simply loaded from a file and fixed, or this might be information that you're bringing in from other newer third-party sources to supplement your modeling. The examples would be information coming from mobile OD data, which is available these days, and such. Now let's explore the creation and user-defined attributes in tables in Visum. So the workflow for creating user-defined attributes in Visum is as follows. We go to Network and select user-defined attributes. And here's a list of all of the user-defined attributes that already exist in this network. You can see different user-defined attributes created for the zone level. There are some user-defined attributes that came in when we imported this file, which is why they are prefixed with IMPT. And if you wanted now to add a new user-defined attribute in this list, you go for Create. Within the object list, you select which object you'd like to give the user-defined attribute to. So let's say you're trying to add user-defined attributes on the link or zone level. You can go for zones over here and then click OK. Then you can type the name of the user-defined attribute. Over here, for example, I can say new attribute as the attribute ID. And then when you tap through it, it auto-generates the code and name. But if you'd like to put more descriptive names or code over here, you can change that and then add some information as applicable for this new user-defined attribute. Then you can select the data type for this, which might be typically either integer, floating point, or it might be text if it contains a certain description about certain parameter or some type of a district name or county name or so forth. Then there are certain options for what type of attribute this is. This is a clear input data attribute. If you want the attribute to be auto-calculated, you can attach a formula to this. So this way, this calculated attribute will have a formula definition, and let's say it is industrial employment multiplied by some sort of factor, and you want this persistently to be held, then you can actually create this as a formula field and then define a different type of attribute type or data type for it. So this is the general way of defining user-defined attributes in Visum. The process remains the same regardless of what network object or data table you're defining these for. For example, over here, we have several user-defined attributes stored, and these will correspond a lot of times to the file structure of information that you're bringing in. Next, we have user-defined tables in Visum. To create user-defined tables in Visum, we go for Edit. Sorry, over here we go for Lists, and then go for user-defined tables. And then you can go for table definitions to create a new table. Over here, you can see we have already a few tables sitting here. These would typically be some of the DBF files that you might be used to using for coefficients and parameters. If you want to add a new table over here, you can go for create and then say new table, for example. Then you can give it a number of columns if you already know those columns. And then you can give it number of rows if you know the number of rows that you're using. So let's say I want to create a single column, 5-row table over here. I can give it this name and then click OK. That creates a user-defined table and creates a default attribute name over here. Now, if you want to not have this attribute or change the name of this attribute, we can go back to Network, User-Defined Attributes, and scroll all the way to this table definition. Over here. And in this attribute, you can change the name of this attribute. Let's say you want to name it coefficient. And then you can copy this. And then if you want to change the data type, you can select from the data type and change this name. Now we also have user-defined matrices in Visum. So you can store matrices in different format in Visum, and these are typically defined at multiple levels. Let's take a look. To add a new matrix in Visum, you can click the matrices tab over here and then click create matrices. Now you can see that you can define matrices as a demand matrix. Typically this is used to hold trips, and then a skim matrix, which is used to typically hold generalized cost or some sort of impedance characteristic. Then you can create matrices at primarily 2 but also 3 levels. This would be the zone level, which is your typical TAZ dimension matrix. If you have main zones in Visum, which would be corresponding to, let's say, districts, you can have the matrix at the district level. And this linkage between zone and main zone allows you to automatically aggregate the zonal results into a district level data. We also store matrices on the stop area level. So if you want to store impedances from stop to stop, let's say for some of the activity or more disaggregate type models that you're working with, you can create that matrix at the stop area level. Then similar to user-defined attributes, you can have a data matrix, which is static, as in it doesn't change till you actually enter numbers or modify numbers through a formula, or a predefined formula matrix, where you can insert a formula over here and then link it with a certain characteristic in your user-defined attributes. Let's say you want to automatically scale an external trip table to a forecast year, and you have the forecast year ID or something like that stored already in your version file. You could create that as a formula matrix so that when you specify a new year, the matrix is automatically scaled to the updated year. And then you can create matrices as, let's say, a fixed matrix. If you want to create multiple matrices, for example, you can see over here different demand groups. Then you can enter how many matrices you'd like to create and then edit its properties. Now, once you've created these matrices, you can edit some of these properties such as names and code of matrix and such by right-clicking over here and then looking at list. All of these, again, support clipboard copy paste. So let's say you have a definition stored in Excel or text file, you can copy and paste from that. Or you can simply type in the definitions over here and replicate them. So this is the basic workflow for matrix definitions in Visum and user-defined attributes definition in Visum. Now we look at actually how to create this model structure that we had for different demand groups in Visum. For example, home-based work, income class 1, 2, 3, 4, and such. So the workflow for model structure creation is as follows. First, we add the model and specify the model type. Then we select the applicable modes for the model. Then we specify the names of demand strata, add or remove different market segments. Once we define these market segments, it automatically creates placeholders to store results for those market segments. For example, for the trip generation, production attraction values, the variables or the attributes used to store those results are automatically generated. Let's see how to create these in Visum in a network file that I have stored. So I have this network file over here, and it only consists of a network. So in this file, if we go to demand and demand models, we don't have an existing model. So to create a model, we first click create over here and add the model. You can name or give a new code to this model. Let's say you wanted to code it as Olympus. You can give it a short name as a code, and then so this way you can create the model and the model type. And then you can select the different type of model you want, which is 4-step or any of these other model types. You can select all of the modes that are allowed for this model. Then in the demand strata for the 4-step model, you can go and create different demand strata by clicking create. And then let's say I had to create different trip types over here. I would say home-based work, then home-based other, and let's say non-home based. These you can then copy and paste over here, or you can give a more descriptive name over here. So this is the general format of creating a model structure in Visum. Now, sometimes there might be a fairly detailed model format, and you may not want this model format to be actually created each time you open a new network and want to transfer this model. So for that, we have the ability to store this model structure in a file and then transfer it from one network to another network. So in this case, let's say you want to store this model format, you can go for OK, and then File, Save As, Demand Data, and then store this with a new name. And that DMD file then holds the definition of this entire model. You can change what attributes for the model you want to store over here. And that way, some components can be skipped and some components can be added or removed as you like. Now I already have a model structure for the old Olympus, the other Olympus model that I see over here. In this case, I have the model structure defined as this 4-step model with all of these demand strata. So if you'd like to transfer this to this network file, which doesn't have a model structure, you can then go for demand models. Let me remove this particular model and load my model from a template instead. So load model template. I have this Olympus version 5 model structure stored over here. And I click OK. Click yes. And then if there are conflicts while running the model import, you might see some messages like this. And this will give you reasonable description of what might be conflicting. So part of that model structure were also matrices or matrix IDs, which already exist in this network. So if this kind of conflict exists, you can choose from these different options and then move forward with the import. Over here, I'm okay with not importing those matrix keys because those keys already exist. So I'll say suppress and then continue. And then that transfers that model structure. So you can see the same modes are selected over here. And then all of the new demand strata came in from that model structure file. So this is one convenient way to create a certain model template or demand structure template and then transfer it to other networks which may not have that demand structure, so you can replicate your models quickly like this. So for model structure transfer, again, is the same demand file that we just looked at. So the workflow for this was first create a model in a certain Visum network, and then save that using the save demand file menu, and then load the model that has only the network in which you want to apply this demand model, and then use the load model template to load this new model structure into an empty network file. Next, we take a look at using list and table views. So list and table views in Visum can be used to explore and manage data for various network objects. A lot of times you might be working with 3 or 4 list and tables more frequently than any other. These would be your zone listing for land use data, and then your coefficient of parameter listing to input parameters in your model, and then the link listing to then look at traffic assignment results, aggregating those results with VMT and so forth. Another useful or handy feature in the listing is that it can also be used to auto-generate several different user-defined attributes in a more automated way. We'll have a look at an example of this shortly, but let's see some of the other features of this listing. So it supports the index data exchange with a clipboard. So you can use Excel to update your data and then bring that data back into Visum using this clipboard interface, which will place basically all of the attribute values based on a lookup column ID. And each different network element or object has different kind of IDs that are used to map data back into it. Then you have the listing synchronized with the network view. So this way, if you have the synchronization checked on, as you click in the listing, the network object corresponding to that selected row is highlighted in Visum, so you can go examine and troubleshoot network objects like that. We try to provide as much Excel-like functionality in these listings, which includes in-place filters, grouping and aggregation, and as well as value-based color coding of the list view. In addition, if you have a certain list view brought up already, you can save layouts. That way you can directly use the layouts when you want to examine certain standard results. For let's say your land use input data or your trip generation results or link flows with VMT setting and so forth. In Visum, the listings are directly generated with in-memory data, which is basically your version file. So it doesn't depend on any stored data outside of this version file. So this way, you won't need to necessarily have a linkage with a DBF table stored somewhere in case of a Visum listing. The workflow for bringing up any list in Visum or a table view in Visum is essentially the same for all of the objects. First, we use the list menu to open the listing for the desired object or layer. Then we select the required attributes from the selection menu. So the attributes that you want to view or the column names. So this way, when you bring in the listing or attribute selection, you'll see some attributes over here on the left-hand side, which can potentially be shown, and the right-hand side, which actually show up in your list view. So you can restructure this list view as you like, and then you can save that as a template so that you don't have to make this selection over and over again when you bring up this list view the next time over. So let's have a look at how this works in Visum through an example. Here I go back to my file. Let's say I want to have a look at a zone listing. I can go for list, network, and then zones. Over here you see kind of a default view specified. But if I want to create a custom view, then I go for select attributes. Then I can get rid of any of these attributes that I don't want over here. I hold Shift and select. And then I click this arrow key to remove these from the list view. So this way you can select different attributes that you would like to view. If there's something over here that you'd like to see, let's say you want to see the location for the well-known text. You can bring that up and place it in any location in your list over here. And then when you finalize this table view, you can click OK. And then you'll see the list view that you just created. If you want to save this list view as a layout, then you can go for List, Save Layout, and then name it. Call it WKT. And then that gets stored as a layout. So next time you want to bring up this view, you simply have to open that layout file to bring that up. You can do that by either going to List, Open Layout, and selecting the layout. Or if you already have your project directory set, those layouts are directly applicable or available in the list over here. So I had another custom listing stored over here, which was the zone attribute list. If I select that, I will then see automatically all of the attributes I had over here. Now these list views also support grouping and on-the-fly editing. Now let's say you wanted to group this list based on some attribute. Let's say this ST county. You can go for, again, the select attributes menu and then check on aggregate and then select the type of grouping that you want to perform on all of these different types of attributes. Over here, we are summing all these up. So you can select sum. In some other attributes, which might be kind of a rate, over here it's worker per household. You may want something like an average, let's say. So I can select the average over there and then click OK. So that will collapse your view into a grouping. So over here, there were just two groups for this. One was 0 and the other one had this number. If you had multiple groupings, you would see kind of a bigger pivot table type of view. And then you can again copy and paste this into your clipboard. So let me ungroup this view now and then click OK. Then if you want to color code your list view, that's possible by selecting the top of the list and right clicking. Then you can specify a color scheme and then say set color scheme for either all columns or for this specific column that I've selected. So now this is single family dwelling units. So let's say I wanted to classify this color view and say edit color for the column and then change that to attribute characteristic. And then I can specify over here classify display. So for this one, I have SFDU. Let's say you want to classify this into 2 with a breakpoint of 120. You can give this, let's say, green and then a red. This way, this list will be classified based on that value into colors. If I click OK over here, you can see that this list view gets color coded in here. Next, it's the network view synchronization. So let's say now that you have this list view that you want to see along with the network, you can split this window and select anywhere in this list, and you can see that all of the zones that you check over here get selected also in the network. If you pick multiple entries, all of those will get selected up to a maximum limit that Visum sets internally. You can then bring that original view back up. If you wanted to filter this on certain properties, it's possible to directly filter this. So you can specify a filter and say larger than, and then say 500. And then in place, filter these attributes with in place filters. Here I can check the filter off now. And then you can also perform edit functionality on this listing. So here you can select the column, right click, and then hit edit. Now, if you want to project these internal external productions, you can either apply a formula to that, or you can say factor and enter your factor, let's say 1.3 or something. And then that would be your forecast IE production, and that will scale up your production value for the internal external. And then the last part, but also an interesting one, is that clipboard copy paste. So once you have this listing over here, you can copy this and paste it into Excel. I have an Excel template over here. Let me open this inputs template. I can create a new tab, go for the list and say copy to clipboard, select Excel, and then Control V to paste back the listing. Over here, you can select your delimiters and so forth. It'll go in as a semicolon delimited file in this case. So it'll store all of these headers. Now let's look at some of the definitions with these headers and come back to the version file. So we created the required list view, we copied it to the clipboard and then pasted it into Excel. Then we can update that data table as needed Let's say you're projecting some values, you can do that. And then we saw these headers. So these headers essentially allow the clipboard to store the fact that this is a Visum file. And then there's a key value over here. Let's say for the zones, it's the key value is based on the zone number that can be used to bring back the data. Now let's go back to Visum and have a look at this. I had this particular listing, but now let's say I have this zone data. I have this vision tag over here and the zone tag over here. I can go and copy a portion of this listing, say all the way to the end over here, and go Control C, go back to Visum, and then go to the paste menu and then click paste. This way, if you have the column headers already inside Visum, it will generate those column headers and link those up. If you didn't have these column headers already, then you can generate these. And this is one way to auto-generate user-defined attributes if you have several user-defined attributes. So let's say you wanted to create a new one over here. You can create on the fly a new user-defined attribute. And this would typically apply to importing data, let's say for the first time into a Visum version file. So this is a quick shortcut to creating multiple user-defined attributes in one go based on a column header. Then you can click OK to bring this data back in. So this is the overall view of the list views in Visum. Now we'll have a look at how the network editor works in Visum, or the matrix editor works in Visum, sorry. This matrix editor again works similar to the listing, but it just shows up in a matrix format. Again, it allows the copy and paste through clipboard, so you can copy portions of the matrix, edit, modify, and bring it back into the matrix data. You can use it to perform interactive matrix calculations such as aggregations, projection to control totals, and so forth. Then it also provides a list view. So if you want to have like an IJV type of view, that's provided over here. Again, this matrix editor is also synchronized with the network view. So you can click in the matrix editor and see the OD pair that corresponds to that cell in the network. Then you can also create trip length distributions using this matrix editor, and then look at those trip length distributions for your typical segments on the fly. So let's have a look at this in Visum and get an idea of how this works. You can go over here to Visum. Let's say I want to look at EE trips. So I can click this EE trips. You can see that this EE trips table at the moment is empty. So now if I want to bring in data into this EE trip table, I can go for right click either over here and say open from file, or you can look at this button over here and say read matrix contents. I have a subfolder over here for matrices where I can select my EE trips and click open, and that will load all of the EE trips into this table. So let me go all the way in the end over here so you can see the external trips. Similar to this, if I wanted this trip table, I have another stored trip table over here. Go to matrices, distribution, click open, and then you can see that this table also has some values in there. So if you select these again and look at the network view, it's all synchronized within the network view. If you want to perform any cell-by-cell operations over here, you can use these shortcuts over here to edit the matrix or add new data into it. So let's say you wanted to add two matrices, you can select these and add these matrices. You can perform some of these transformations on the matrix. You can take a transpose. You can use the set diagonal if you want to set diagonal. So these are kind of interactive features that you might do for certain trip tables. Typically, if you're applying Visum also more in the traffic engineering context. There are also functionality for projection, or what you might typically know as furnessing the trip table. So let's say you're trying to project to forecast P&A totals, then you can use a projection to target value, and then you can use a double constraint projection and then set your projection values or projected P&A from an attribute in the zone level, and then run this calculation to essentially furnace your trip table to a forecast condition. Then another useful thing to do with the matrix editor is to calculate trip length distributions. Now for trip length distribution, we typically also need a skim matrix. So over here, I can first run a skim matrix or skim calculation. And then if I look at this distribution matrix and select the histogram button, this gives me a basic default kind of histogram. But what we want is to classify this trip table based on the skim values. So we can go for then view options and say use classification matrix. And then I'm going to use the skim matrix over here. So let's say I want this classified by distance. And then I click OK over here. 0. Now I can define my intervals. So I can select this insert new intervals with a lower limit of 0, let's say an upper limit of 80, and let's say I want 12 of these. Then you can go for recalculate, and this will give you the trip length distribution that you're typically used to seeing with some of your calculations. Then again, you can copy these distributions to Excel if you want to analyze some of this data further or put it in kind of an Excel chart or so forth. But this gives you a quick analysis while you're calibrating your model for trip length distribution. Some of these summaries can also be generated in bulk, and we'll have a look at those when we look at network calculations and procedure calculations in Visum.